In Fallout 4, you can build your own settlements, and in this guide, I will go through everything you need to know when it comes to building settlements in Fallout 4. Hi, I'm Mo, and I'm trapped in Fallout. Before talking about building up a settlement, we first need to talk about settlement build mode and how you get access to it. In order to build a settlement, you will first need to find a location that has a workshop in it, and that will allow you to build a settlement. So in this instance, I happen to be in Abernethy Farm, which is directly south of Sanctuary. And if I go into the farm, then you will see these game objects called workshops. And any location you find a workshop in will allow you to build in that settlement. In Fallout 4, in the base game anyway, there are actually 30 settlements, with more settlements available to you in the DLC. So at the moment, if I click on the supply lines button, which I will discuss a little bit later in the video, at this point in time, I happen to have access to 3 settlements. I've got one in Sanctuary, Red Rocket, and Abernethy Farm. But there are at least 30 settlements that you can play with in the base Fallout 4 game. As already mentioned, you will actually need to gain access to a workshop when trying to build in a settlement. So let's just say that you happen to stumble across a location and you happen to find a workshop in one of those locations, then you can build in that settlement. But the thing is, these workshops aren't always directly accessible, or rather not instantly accessible. Sometimes they are actually locked behind quests. Primarily, you want to do quests for the Minutemen and the Railroad, and as you do that, you will then gain access to the workshop in that settlement. There are also other settlements that you can simply walk into, and you will find these NPCs known as settlers in that same workshop. And as you speak to the settlers, they may give you a quest, and when you complete the quest, that may also unlock the settlement for you. And with that, now that we've effectively spoken about how to gain access to a settlement, let's go ahead and actually talk about entering this settlement build mode, which is effectively the first thing we need to really discuss before we talk about building up a settlement. So in this case, to actually access a workshop is quite simple. You just go to it and interact with it. So I'm just going to go ahead and select the workshop option. And with this new menu that has popped up is effectively the settlement build mode in Fallout 4, and this will allow you to build this settlement. Now, once you're in this mode, let's focus on the menu on the top of this mode, starting from the left where it says people. In this case, people is actually referred to the number of settlers or NPCs or humans or ghouls that currently live in this settlement, which is currently showing a value of 6. So this means there are 6 NPCs in this settlement. Going to the next option of food, this is simply telling us that this settlement will produce 10 food each day. The next is water, that in this instance is telling us that it produces 3 water every day. And then we have power, which is effectively telling us how much power is in this settlement. Power is effectively another word for electricity. Then we have defense, which is telling us the defense rating of this settlement. And next we have beds, which is simply telling us the number of beds in this settlement. Then we have happiness, which is actually telling us quite an important rating, which we will go into in a lot of detail a little bit later in the video. But this is effectively telling us the current happiness rating of the settlement. And lastly, size. This is telling us the current capacity of you building objects in this settlement. So again, we will go into that in a moment, but the short of it is you cannot infinitely build in a settlement. There is a cap to the amount of game objects that you can build in any given settlement. This has primarily been put in to prevent your game from crashing, but the important thing to note is this is a limit and you cannot just build forever in a settlement. There is a cap. Now you may have noticed the color of those numbers. Some are green, some are red. When a number is green, so when one of these stats is green, that simply means that there is enough of that resource to satisfy the number of people in that settlement. So for example, we have 6 people and we have 10 food. So 10 food is more than plentiful to satisfy 6 people per day in game. When we look at water, on the other hand, water is currently set to 3 and there are 6 people. So that is why water is red. When you have a resource that is red, that is simply telling you that this settlement is not producing enough water to satisfy the needs of the people in this settlement. Now let's start talking about the bottom menu, which is primarily where you will be focusing most of your efforts in this settlement guide. The menu at the bottom is where you actually are able to build things in a settlement. So for instance, if I go into furniture and then I go into something like beds, then here I have all the options available to me to be able to build a bed. Similarly, if I looked at something else such as defense, and then I go into something like guard post, then this is again where I would be able to build a guard post. The menu at the bottom is effectively your gateway to build whatever you want in a settlement on the basis that you're actually able to build it in the first place. Now, when trying to actually build something, you will get another menu pop up on the sort of the top right of the screen. So in this instance, I am trying to build a barn, and if you look at the menu for it, you will see the word barn, which is the name of the object you're trying to build, with a number inside the brackets. This is simply telling us the total number of barns you can build based on the resource you have. And with that, we need to now quickly talk about resources. Where do you get resources? And what do they mean? So when building any objects in the game, so in this instance, if I happen to go into something like, again, let's just go into furniture and let's go into chairs just to make it a bit more simpler. Here I can build a chair, but to build this chair, I will actually need two different resources. I will need some cloth and I will need some aluminium. So the question is, where do you get cloth and where do you get aluminium from? Primarily, there are two places to get resources from. When you're in settlement build mode, which is the mode I'm in right now, you can actually go and highlight objects such as this. And when you highlight the object, you get an option at the bottom called the scrap option. And if I select the scrap option, then in this case, if I happen to scrap this barrel, this will give me this type of resource, which is a steel resource. So if I go ahead and press the A button, I have now scrapped that barrel, and in return I have obtained 4 steel resources. And this is one way of getting resources. So when you're in settlement build mode and you happen to go around and scrap things, so again, let's go and scrap this wire fence. From scrapping this wire fence, I will get 2 resources. In this case, 1 wood and 1 steel. There is a second way of getting resources, and that is to go and visit vendors and buy junk items from them. When you visit a vendor in the game, you have the option to buy junk items from them, and by doing so, you will basically get resources. Now, the last thing, given that we've spoken about the 2 primary ways of getting resources, where are resources stored? Well, they are actually stored in your workshop. So if you now access the workshop, so this time I will select the transfer option, and then if you go into the junk menu, this is where all your resources are stored. So when I scrapped that barrel, that 4 steel actually went into this workshop. And when I scrapped that wire fence, the wood and the steel went into the workshop. If I happen to purchase items from a vendor, what I would need to do is manually store those items in the workshop, and then those resources will become available in this settlement. So that is how you get resources. Now, going back to that menu, so if I go back into settlement build mode, again, I'm just going to go and interact with the workshop. If I go back to that same chair, just to describe the menu on the top right, this is now naming that object, which is an airplane seat, and in this case is telling me I can build a total of 79. But then if we look at the actual listed resources, this is basically telling me the amount of that resource I have in my workshop and the amount I need to build this seat. So I happen to have, based on this menu, 475 cloth resources in my workshop, but I will need 6 to build this airplane seat. And likewise, I have 1,430 aluminium resources in the workshop, but I will need 4 to build this seat. So this is basically what that menu means, and this is how you go ahead and identify whether you can build something or not. In other words, if you don't have enough resources, you will not be able to build that particular thing. So if I show you something like food, here, this is telling me that I need at least 1 corn to be able to place this corn, which I don't have, so I can't place this corn. But if I look at something like a melon, I happen to have 9 melons, so I can go ahead and place this melon because I have enough to be able to place at least 9. Now that we've briefly spoken about building things and scrapping things and getting resources, let's talk about actually scrapping things in your settlement, because there is some complexity behind that also. When you actually are in your settlement build mode and you highlight something, so let's just say we are looking at this tato plant. This is highlighted in a green color. But notice if I actually highlight the barrel, so this barrel here, this is highlighted in a yellow color. And there is a reason for this difference in color. Anything that is highlighted in a green color is deemed an interactable object, and anything that is yellow is deemed not an interactable object. What that basically means is anything that is green, your NPCs or people or settlers in the settlement can actually interact with it. So for instance, right here, this is a green highlighted object. Therefore, this NPC is able to highlight or rather interact with this object. But this barrel here isn't highlighted in green, which means no NPCs can actually interact with it. In other words, they can't really do anything with it. They can't sit on it, they can't move it. It's to them more or less an idle object that cannot be actioned with in any way whatsoever. So with that in mind, when you're actually in your settlement and you actually want to clean your settlement, so there is a concept of when you actually unlock a settlement, you may actually want to clean your settlement so that you can build fresh. What you ideally want to do is scrap stuff that are in yellow, because that will give you plenty of resources. So if I scrap that, or if I can find something else that is highlighted in yellow, for instance, I don't happen to have anything right now, but something else that is perhaps in yellow, so there you go. I would go ahead and scrap all of those objects. Something else that is ideally worth scrapping are stuff like trees, because you'll get a significant amount of wood resources from that. So if I highlight this tree over here, an NPC will never interact with this, and this is basically an eyesore, so you might as well go ahead and scrap it. However, if you happen to have anything that is green, so something like this, green items are also objects that you can build yourself. So for example, if I go into resources, food, and if I go into tato, yeah, I can place another one right over there. So instead of scrapping green highlighted game objects, you're actually better off using the store option at the bottom of the menu. So we have looked at the scrap option. Now let's take a look at the store option. When you store something, so let's go ahead and store this tato plant, and let's store this one as well, and this one as well. So we've just stored 3 tato plants. If I now go into the tato plant, notice that this has 1 underneath it, this has 2 underneath it, and this has none underneath it, i.e. 0. The reason this has 0 is because there are no stored amount of this in your settlement inventory, whereas there's 1 of this that's already stored and there's 2 of this that are already stored. So what does store actually mean? Basically, all it means is that you can build 2 of these resources for free without using up any additional resources, and that is because you store them in your inventory. Whereas this one, if I build this one, this is again another inventory that I have stored, so I can build it for free. Now, if you notice, there are no more numbers. Now, if I build something, it will use up a resource. So I have 36 tato at the moment. If I build one, I now have 35. The whole point of storing these objects is that you basically save resources in the long run. So here, again, this is a green highlighted game object, and it's a wire fence. You may decide that, you know what, it doesn't make a lot of sense for me to store this, so I'll scrap it and get some resources from this instead. However, for something like plants or for something like furniture, so if I go inside, there you go, for something like furniture, this I am likely to build again at a later stage, so I may as well store this object and not scrap it. This one, again, chances are I may actually use this as part of a leisure center or something later on, so I'll go ahead and store this. Or this vase here, chances are I probably won't use it, so I may as well go and scrap it, and so on and so on. So the idea is you do need to think about a little bit when it comes to what you want to store and what you want to scrap, because it will help you to save resources in the long run. Now let's talk about settlers or people or NPCs that you will find in a settlement. When you unlock a settlement for the first time, there may be some NPCs or people in your settlement, and from now on we will refer to these people as settlers, because that is effectively their technical term, so to speak, and to make the context of this video a little bit easier. So in this settlement I have 6 settlers, and settlers actually are the living breath of your settlement. They are what makes your settlement a functioning, thriving settlement. And in this case, I happen to have 6. And if you notice, when I highlight a settler, they also have a green highlight, which means you can interact with them also. In a settlement, typically you can have, I think, up to 10 to begin with, but then based on your charisma level, you may have more settlers. So the number of settlers you have in your settlement depends on your charisma special stat. When it comes to settlers, you can actually assign them tasks. So for instance, if I go to this settler and if I highlight them, notice that these tattoo plants are also highlighted. And that is because this settler is actually tending to these crops. You can assign them tasks. Now, if I were to do something like, let's just say, build a guard post. If you look, this is now on that right hand menu showing a red Vault Boy. And the reason it is red is because the game is telling you that this will produce defense, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But at the moment, it is red. Red means it is unassigned. In other words, there are no settlers currently assigned to this. So if I were to go ahead and look at this settler, so Blake is currently tending to these crops. So again, I'm not highlighting the crops, I'm highlighting Blake. If I were to highlight a crop, then this doesn't highlight Blake. So highlighting a game object won't tell you who is actually taking care of that prop or crop, but highlighting a settler will tell you what task they're looking at. So now if I interact with Blake, and notice my options at the bottom has now changed. If I now highlight this guard post and interact with this, and notice the assign option at the bottom, you should get a pop-up on the top left-hand menu saying this resource is now assigned. And now Blake has been assigned to that guard post, and as a result, our defense has gone up. Again, we'll talk about defense a little bit later, but the whole point is a settler can be assigned tasks. Now, something else to note is, if you notice, now if I highlight Blake, those crops in the background are not highlighted anymore. And that is because a single settler can only be assigned to a single task at any given time. A settler cannot be assigned more than one task at any given time. And again, this will become important in a moment. But this is basically what you can do with settlers. Now, there are other things you can also do with settlers. So notice at the beginning of this video, I said that I happen to have 3 settlements. You can actually send settlers to different settlements also. So let me go and try and find a idle settler. So there you go. There's a settler right there. If I go to that settler and select the move option, I can actually send them to a different settlement. And as a result, they will end up becoming a settler in a different settlement. The reason you would want to do that is simply for balancing purposes. So let's just say over time in this settlement, you happen to have, say, something like 20 settlers, but you only have enough resources for, say, 10. You may want to send these 10 settlers to other settlements where they could actually use that additional help. Now, the last thing to talk about settlers is supply lines. Now, what are supply lines? Well, a settlement, as we have seen in the top menu of the settlement build mode, can produce resources. So in this case, I am now producing 11 food, probably because I put down some additional food, and I'm producing 3 water. Again, we'll get into the details of that in a moment, but this settlement is producing more food than it is producing water, but also it actually is producing enough food for enough people. What you can do is share these resources with other settlements, including sharing your resources that you have in your workshop with other settlements. So if I go back into the menu, there is what's called a supply line. So this line over here between Sanctuary and Red Rocket. And what this is telling us is the resources between these 2 settlements are currently being shared. So let's just say, for the sake of our example, Sanctuary happens to have, say, 10 corn and Red Rocket has 0 corn. So as a result, you cannot build any corn crops in Red Rocket. Because there's a supply line here now, you can now build corn or place corn in Red Rocket because Sanctuary has corn. So supply lines are actually pretty important because they help you to share resources between settlements. So now the question is, how do you actually set up a supply line? Well, to set up a supply line, you actually first need to unlock the local leader perk in the charisma tree, and you need to have at least 1 rank in this perk. When you do that, you can set up the supply lines. So with that, how do you actually set up supply lines? Well, you need to highlight a settler that is currently not assigned. So if we go back to Blake, notice that he is assigned. So if we look at the top right menu, he is assigned with this defense icon, telling us he is currently assigned to a defense like object. If we look at someone else, so I'll try and find an NPC. So this NPC here, they are assigned to a food icon. So they are assigned to some crops. If I now look at this NPC or settler, they are showing a red vault boy, which means they're not assigned to anything. So you can ask him to set up a supply line. And the way you do that is select the supply line option at the bottom. And when you do that, I can now ask him to go and set up a supply line. So I will select red rocket truck stop. And now if I look at my supply line in my map, notice that there is now a supply line between Abernethy Farm and Red Rocket. And as it happens, if you sort of grasp the concept of this, these three are now sharing the resources between all three. So again, if there happens to be some crop in Sanctuary, which I didn't earlier have, Abernethy Farm should now be able to build some crops. Now I'm not sure, I'm going to have a quick look to see if I do have any crops. And in this case, I actually do happen to have some carrots. So I'm not sure which settlement it is, either Sanctuary or Red Rocket. One of those two settlements has some carrots. And as a result, I can now place carrots in this settlement because we are sharing the resources between the three settlements. And now, before talking about actually building things, let's talk about one last thing: the boundary around your settlement. So when you enter settlement mode, you will see this transparent green barrier or green fence that goes all the way around your settlement. This is effectively telling you what the build area is for this settlement. In other words, what you can build in this settlement. So if I again go and place that crop, notice I can place it here, but notice I cannot place it there. It is showing a red highlighted icon or red highlighted border. And that is because I cannot build or place that crop outside that green border. So this green border is actually pretty important when it comes to placing objects in a settlement. You do need to consider this. Now this can be abused a little bit, which we may go into a little bit later in the video, but the concept of it is that this green border is telling you what your build area is. Now there is also an invisible green border up in the sky. Although you cannot build, say, horizontally, you also cannot infinitely build vertically. In other words, you cannot endlessly build into the sky. But the border in the sky is actually invisible. You cannot see it. It is different for different settlements. The easiest way to explain it is probably if I start to go and build some stairs. So if I just quickly try and build some stairs, so floors, and if I just do that, what I'm going to do is just build stairs endlessly just to sort of prove what I mean. So here I've built a few floors now, and if I keep on going, at some point this will become red, telling me that I cannot build any further. So Abernethy Farm happens to have a pretty high threshold, but notice I cannot build this set of stairs anymore because that is the maximum height I can build in this location. So as you can see, Abernethy Farm actually goes relatively quite high up, but other settlements such as Sanctuary may only give you perhaps 3 or 4 levels, while some may only give you even significantly less, perhaps 1 or 2, while others can give you a great amount. So in this location we can go, I'm just going to guess 10 levels here, but in other locations not as many. Now that we have effectively finished talking about settlement build mode and everything that you practically need to know about it, let's start talking about finally building stuff. So in this case, the first thing I like to do personally is to clean out my settlements. By doing that, I tend to get a bunch of resources, which is also helpful because you can also end up sharing these resources with other settlements. But by cleaning all the junk or rubbish or game objects, whatever you want to call it in a settlement, you end up with a clean canvas. Now, in this case, the first thing I personally like to do is to build a place for my settlers to live in. And this will become important why I do that. But before we do that, there's something you need to consider. When building in a settlement, you can use existing structures if you want to. So you can use this structure here, for example, and build around it, or you can build your own. I personally like to build my own because this will play a role very importantly when we start to talk about beds and happiness. So I'll save that discussion for a little bit later in the video. But getting to the short of it, I like to build my own settlements, or rather I like to build my own places or shelter for my settlers to live in. So to do that, we're going to go into structures, wood, and then we're going to go into floor. And I'm just going to start placing these shack foundations. And what I like to do to get a base going, and you can always come back and upgrade this later, is to build a 3x3. So I'm going to quickly build a 3x3, and with that done, I'm now going to build some walls. When it comes to walls, I'm not going to go all the way around because I do want to leave some empty gaps in my walls to allow settlers to actually be able to come into the building. So I'm just going to build a wall, a wall on each side, and then I'm going to place roofs, and for roofs, I'm actually going to place a roof everywhere. So I'm going to totally cover this off, and once I've finished the roof, what we should have is a structure that actually looks very simple. When it comes to building shelters, you don't actually have to build something that's complicated. You don't have to have doors and windows and so on and so on. This is actually good enough to get a shelter going. By no means is this the best and efficient way. You can of course make this aesthetically look more pleasing, but to actually get a building going, this is actually good enough. Now the reason why we or rather I build a shelter first is now I can start to place things around it and make this shelter the focal point or the focus point of the settlement. With that done, now let's start to focus on some of the resources. So notice we have 0 water. So let's sort that out first. To build water, what we will go is to go to resources and then water. And from here, you actually have a couple of options. You can build water powered pumps. You can build water directly coming from the ground. You have a few options. Something we can do is, well, we actually haven't spoken about the amount of resources we need. So in this settlement, we have 6 people. 6 people, or rather 6 settlers, will need 6 water per day to satisfy their needs. So if I build this first one, let's just place it here. Notice I now have 3 water. This is actually not enough for the people. Although they are happy, this is actually not enough water. A settler will need at least 1 water per day to satisfy their water needs. Now, what I tend to do is actually equate for 12 settlers when building a settlement for the first time. So what I will do is actually build enough so that I generate 12 water. And I can do that quite easily by simply building 4 water pumps. So by building 4 water pumps, what will happen is this resource, or rather this settlement, will start to generate 12 water per day. And of this 12 water, 6 will get consumed by the 6 settlers. So let's just say I happen to have another settler join this settlement in the next day or two, and the people number jumps from 6 to 7. Then what I will now start to do is actually use 7 water per day. So the question is, what happens to that extra water? i.e., if I'm producing 12 water per day and there are 6 settlers, what happens to the remaining 6? Well, they get stored in your workshop. And that is what happens when you start to share resources. So notice when I actually built water, even though the water was just 3, so I'll do that again. I will store these. Even though the water is 3, it's still showing as green. So if you remember earlier in the video, I said that if a resource is red, that means there's not enough of it in this settlement. This settlement is currently showing a water of 3, but it is showing the water to be green. And that is because this settlement has a supply line with other settlements and it's getting its water from other settlements. So you don't have to build more water, but ideally you want to, because you want every settlement to sustain itself in case supply lines break. And yes, supply lines can break if a settlement is under attack, or if that settler disappears that is in charge of the supply line. So going back, I am building 12 water pumps to satisfy the needs of the settlers in this settlement. And because I've built 12 and I've got 6, at the end of the day I will basically end up with 6 additional water resources that I can share with other settlements. Now let's move on to the next thing, food. So food is pretty important, and how do you get food? So we've already touched on that when we were talking about settler assignment tasks, but let's now specifically focus on food. To place food or generate food in a settlement, you need to go into resources and then food, and from here you can now start to place food. So I will place some tato plants simply because I happen to have enough of it in this settlement. So I'm going to place, to begin with, just 2. Now, before I talk a little bit more detail, notice on the right hand menu, this is showing 0.5. In other words, this food will produce 0.5 amount of food per day. If I looked at something like a mud fruit, which I don't happen to have at the moment, but if I just look at it for argument's sake, if I did have any mud fruit and placed it down, that would have produced one food instead. So this is telling us the amount of food resources this particular crop will generate per day. Now what I will do is place another 2 more, and notice that these are showing red because I don't have a settler currently assigned to this. So what I'm going to do is just grab a settler really quickly and assign them to the crop. So I'm again going to grab Blake and I'm going to run back. I probably should have placed the food a little bit closer to the settler itself, but anyhow, if I just do that, and I notice on the top that my food number is gone up, and it's gone up to 2. In other words, Blake is now assigned to that food. Now, when it comes to assigning something to settlers, in particular food and defense, and we'll talk about defense, a settler, although they can be assigned to one task, they also have a cap on the amount of that task or the capacity of that task that they can do. When it comes to food, a single settler can actually look after 6 food resources in total at any given time. So if I placed, since I have 2 food resources produced at the moment, by 2 I mean this is producing 0.5, this is producing 0.5, so in total this is giving me 2. If I now place more, so this will be 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5 and 6. Notice that the settler who is currently not assigned to these, if I select the settler again, or I don't even have to, he automatically should start to pick up the food resources. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if I just again go and click on the settler again and assign the foods, then I probably don't have enough. Let me just double check. Nope, I actually have enough for 5. I didn't realize I missed 2. So if I put 2 more down and again select the settler and just assign it, then the settler should now slowly begin to assign these food resources. And with that, if we now have a look at the food value, that should go all the way up to 6. And now this settler will look after these crop resources until you change their task. So with this, we now have 6 food. Now again, we have 6 settlers and we only have 6 food. So what I'm going to do is again create another 6 food. So again, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And now notice, unlike last time where Blake basically automatically assigned themselves, he is now not assigning the other food to himself because a single settler can only have up to 6 capacity based resources at any given time. So if I selected this settler, so that's Coney, and then if I asked her to go and look after these crops, so just select the one crop, they should now start to look after all 6 of these. And with that, we have now also reached our maximum 12 in food also. Again, just to keep things equal, I am assigning 12 food. So what will happen is basically the same thing as the water. This settlement is now generating 12 water and 6 will be left behind, and the same logic applies to food as well. The settlers will consume a food resource a day, but 6 will remain in the workshop at the end of the day, again allowing me to share that resource with other settlements. Now, there is one thing you probably may have noticed. When I built the water, water did not have to be assigned to a settler, whereas when I built the food, that had to be assigned to a settler. Water resources typically don't need settlers to generate the resource, whilst food do. So there are some resource objects when building a settlement that do not need settlers to generate that resource, while others such as food and defense do. But we will talk about defense basically next. Now that we have food and water, what will happen is your settlement will actually start to attract attackers, raiders, super mutants, ghouls, deathclaws, and so on. When you start to build a settlement, your settlement might actually get attacked, randomly attacked by other hostile NPCs, and the reason they attack you is simply because your settlement has resources. So when your settlement starts to produce resources, especially if you happen to produce surplus resources, your settlement will be attacked. When your settlement is attacked, you will get a notification telling you that X settlement is being attacked. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, I happen to be way over there in Concord and Abernethy Farm is being attacked. I will get a notification telling me that Abernethy Farm is under attack, and at that point you basically need to make your way to the settlement to defend it. However, if your settlement has enough decent defenses, then it may be able to defend itself when it's under attack, or if your defense is high enough, it may never be attacked. Now, something to note is, well, first of all, we need to talk about how to build defenses, but we'll do that in just a moment. When it comes to the defense stat, that effectively determines the likelihood of your settlement being attacked. It doesn't negate your settlement from being attacked, it simply means the likelihood. So if your settlement happens to have a high defense rating, it may never be attacked, but that is not the same as saying it will never be attacked. Chances are it probably will be attacked at some point in the future. Whereas if your settlement has a low defense, so in this case, this settlement has a defense of 0, it is probably likely to be attacked very often. So with that said, now let's go and actually build some defenses. So defenses come in effectively 3 forms. You can build a guard post, which is where you assign a settler and they will guard that particular area. Or you can build turrets, which are really good because they, as opposed to guard post where the defense of this is pretty much determined by the settler that is using it and the weapon and armor they happen to be carrying. With the turret, they will actually take care of the enemy itself. So if they happen to spot an enemy, then they'll take it out. Or you can set up traps where if you know, or if you happen to have an idea where you are likely to be attacked, you can put down traps and an enemy that is attacking your settlement will set up the trap. Now again, to make it easy, we are just going to go and place some simple guard posts. So like I said, with food, a single settler can look after 6 food. The same logic here applies. A single settler can actually look up to 6 defense. So in this case, if you have a look, a guard post produces 2 defense. So given that I've just put down 3, that is a total of 6. And now what I'll do is put down another 3. So I just put down 1 here, 1 here, and 1 here. And what I can do now is find some settlers and assign them. So again, this settler doesn't happen to be looking at anything at the moment, so I'll interact with them and then I'll ask them to go and guard this post. And now notice that my defense has gone up to 6 because again, a single settler can look up to 6 things at a single given time. And now I'll assign this settler to look at the remaining 3 guard posts to give me the remaining 6 defense. So let me go and quickly find one. So this is currently being looked after. This is currently being looked after, whereas this one isn't. So if I just assign them to this, now my defense has gone up to 12. So with this, now my defense in this settlement is 12, which is basically on par with my food and water. Now, something you may want to do to make life easy is add the amount of food you have and the amount of water you have. So in this case, I happen to have 12 of each. Just add those 2 numbers and set that to be your defense rating to decrease the chances of you being attacked. So what we may do, for example, is maybe build some turrets and place them strategically. So if you place turrets, don't place them on the floor because they can be attacked there. If you place them, say, up here or something, then they are not likely to be attacked by melee attackers at least. And what you can do is bump up your settlement defense that way, and that will sort of help you to increase the chances of you not being attacked. So again, I'm just going to go ahead and store them for now. But this is effectively how you set up defenses in your settlement. And this is why defense is pretty important in a settlement, because if you don't have defenses, your settlement may be attacked. And if your settlement gets attacked, then resources such as a water pump and your crops will actually be destroyed in the process. Next, now let's talk about power. So what is power? Power is effectively another way of saying electricity that you can have in your settlement. And power is what you will need to run electrical objects such as lighting, such as TVs, anything that requires electricity. To do that, what you want to do is actually use this power option, and then what you want to do is build generators. And the bigger the generator you build, the more power you will have. So if I happen to build something like this, a small generator that only produces 3 power, then notice my power option at the top has now gone to 3. If I build more, so let's just say I build this one, then now my power is at 8. So this is now telling me that my settlement is producing 8 power. Typically what you want to do to get a settlement going is to build, again under the power option, this. What you want to do is build a radio beacon, or rather a recruitment radio beacon. And what this will do is attract new settlers. Now when you build objects that require power, so how do I know that? If I highlight this object, notice this is giving me a power icon with a value of 1. To actually use this object in this settlement, I have to attach it to some power source that gives at least 1. So if I do this and attach it to that, now this is green and this will give me a power of 1. You can also attach objects using this thing, which is basically called a power cable. and you can attach multiple objects using this method. So now if I build something else that needs power, so again, if I go into my torus and let's just select something that actually requires a little bit of power, like a spotlight, and I put it up there, then what I can do is attach this to a power generator or attach it to something else that is actually also generated or rather connected to a power generator that will also power that up. So this is why you basically need power. You need power to power up electrical objects, but you can also build something like this to help you recruit more settlers. So if you notice, I actually had a settler of 6. If you now notice on the top right hand corner, it has now been bumped up to 8. So by building this, I've now increased my settlement size by 2. And now let's talk about beds. So at the beginning of this video, or closer to the beginning of this video, I talked about beds and why beds are important and why you should place beds, or rather why you should build a shelter. When placing a bed, so to place a bed, you need to go to furniture, beds, and then you can place a bed from here. Any bed will do. What you want to do is make sure that when you place a bed, you actually place them under a roof, particularly under a roof you've built. And this will become important when we talk about happiness. But for the moment, make sure that you place your beds under roofs that you have built. Now, when it comes to placing beds, thankfully, the quality of the bed doesn't really matter. Just like whether you're placing a tackle plant or a mudfruit plant, any type of bed will do. So if you want to save some resources, you can just place sleeping bags, and that will serve the same quality of sleep to your settlers. So I already happen to have 3 beds, and that's probably because there are 3 beds inside that structure over there. So what I will do is just place enough beds to satisfy again 12 settlers. So I'm just going to quickly do that, and with that I now have 12 beds. So beds are relatively quite easy to place. Again, you don't have to use the best ones, but just to get away with getting a settlement up and running, I've just placed these beds. And again, if you highlight a bed, then the bed will tell you whether a settler is actually occupying that bed or not. So in this case, I probably am occupying 8 beds and I have 4 beds that are still idle. So if this settlement happens to get 4 more settlers over time, then there are still enough resources and beds and defense and so on to satisfy their needs also. So with all of that now said, we have effectively gone through a number of things. We have gone through setting up defenses and why the defense stat is important. We've spoken about food and why that's important. We've also mentioned water and why that's important, and so on. As you sort of start to get used to this, what you can do is start to build places of interest to, again, bring your settlements to life a little bit. In particular, so in this case, what I've done is off screen, I've moved things about. So if you recall, I had some crops here. I've moved them over here instead and made this look a little bit nicer. So this is now what I would call a place of interest to sort of store my food in one place. Also, if I go here, then notice I've now moved my water to one nice place, again, to make it a point of interest. Now, something I didn't mention is you can actually move things in bulks. So when building things, you can move things in bulk. So what does that matter? If I go and highlight, say, this wooden plank right over here, if I can highlight it, then I can basically move it about, right? But if you go and sort of hold on to it, so again, let me try and move something like this, just to sort of show. Again, I can move it about. But if you go and hold your highlight button, you can actually move the entire thing. So you can start to build places of interest by building things collectively together. Now, this can be a bit glitchy, so you do need to be careful. But once you've sort of quite happily placed something, so let's just say I want to place this there for the sake of argument, this will now place that entire object over there. And you can do that even with large objects. So what I will try to do is, if I can, move the entire house. So now I can move this entire house somewhere else. And the way this works is actually based on the collision of the object. So this is where, if you remember earlier in the video where I said you can actually abuse things and build things outside of your boundary, this is how you would do it. So what I can do is the collision of the object I'm selecting is actually the collision that is being taken into account. So what we can do is, if I now place the bed, or rather this object, say something like here, so I'm going to try and place it somewhere a bit sensible, then I can basically move the entire house. And notice I have now ever so slightly gone outside of the boundaries, but this still counts as a place of interest, and so on. So once you get the hang of things, it is worthwhile building places of interest so that you can sort of put things together and rearrange your settlement as you see fit. And now, lastly, let's talk about happiness. Probably one of the most complex resources or stats in a settlement. How do you control the happiness of a settlement? Well, the first thing to understand is when you get a settler arriving in your settlement, that settler by default has a settlement rating of 50. A settler individually can have their settlement happiness go all the way from 0 to 100. So if a settler is happy, then their happiness rating, their individual happiness rating will increase. And if they are unhappy, then it will decrease. Your settlement happiness, so that is the number on the top right when you're in settlement build mode, is actually the average of all your settlers' happiness added together and then divided by that many settlers. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, we had two settlers. One settler had a happiness of 50 and the other settler had a happiness of 50. So 50 plus 50 is 100. Divided by 2 is still 50. Your settlement happiness would be 50. But let's just say one was 40 and one was 60. So again, 40 plus 60 is 100. Divided by 2 is 50. So the way it works, sorry for the math lesson, but the way it works is simply that the settlement happiness is the average of all of your settlers' happiness added together, divided by that many number of settlers. So now the question remains, how do you increase the happiness? Well, first of all, a quick mention. If you happen to have robot settlers, so automatrons that you make yourself, or robots like Ada, or Curie or Codsworth, their happiness actually caps at 50. So if you want to have a settlement happiness of 100, you don't want to have any robots in your settlements. Right, so with that said, now let's talk about how to raise the happiness of an individual settler to 100. Well, when a settler has access to at least one food, their settlement happiness will go up to 20. When that same settler has access to water, it will go up by another 20. When they have access to at least one defense, it will go up by another 20. And when they have access to a bed, their happiness will go up by another 20. So by having, or rather ensuring, that you have at least enough food, water, defense, and beds in your settlement, based on the number of settlers, your settlers' happiness will be at least at 80. Now, this doesn't happen immediately. This happens over time. So notice that I have 8 settlers. I have 12 food, 12 water, 12 defense, and 12 beds. That means my settlement happiness should be at least 80 right off the bat, but it isn't. And it isn't because the happiness gradually goes up, and likewise, it gradually goes down. So in this instance, because I happen to have enough of everything, the settlement happiness will individually go up. Now, that explains 80 points out of the possible 100. What about the remaining 20 points? How do you get that? Well, there really isn't an exact math. A lot of good informed YouTubers have definitely made some content around that, and I may do so myself one day. But for the moment, the easiest thing you can do is actually build 3 things, or rather build 2 things specifically and recruit 1 thing. What you can do is start to build things like clinics, bars, and you can also start to recruit pets. So in this settlement, I do happen to have a cat somewhere. You probably have seen it throughout the video from time to time, but I do happen to have a cat somewhere. And if you happen to recruit pets, and the way to recruit pets is actually to go into cages, small cages, and then you can build something like a cat cage or a dog cage and so on. And this will actually end up recruiting pets over time. By building cages to recruit pets, and by building points of interest like restaurants or clinics, this will help you to increase and get those additional bonus points in happiness. What you can also do is to also build in-game objects that produce happiness, and that is identified by this smiley icon that you see on the right hand menu. If you build objects like this, ever so slightly, this will also help to increase the happiness of your settlers. So just a quick summary. To increase the happiness of your settlement, you actually need to focus on the individual needs of a settler. If you increase the happiness of individual settlers, then overall the happiness of your settlement will increase. In this guide, I went through the basics of everything that you need to know to build a settlement from the ground up. Something that settlements can play a big role in is playing Fallout 3 in survival mode. So when playing Fallout 4 in survival mode, having settlements is actually a pretty good thing. If you want to learn almost everything there is to know about survival mode for Fallout 4, then click on the video you see on the screen right now. Click on the video you see on the screen right now to find out more about survival mode in Fallout 4.